Pam is a staff writer at Texas Monthly. She's been there since 1997. She grew up in New York, graduated from Brown, and I'm going to mention a couple of her articles. The 2001 article on school prayer was up for a national award. She also received at the New Yorker, you wrote a story on how Crawford Ranch was being used as sort of this media set by George Bush to sort of play up this sort of down-home cowboy kind of guy. And you were featured in 2007, 2008 Best American Crime Reporting, 2006 Best Sports Writing. And I thought this was cute. I was doing some research on her and I discovered that she's in the New York Times article for being married to her husband Chad. They met in Austin on a road trip or something. And they have a child named Jake and another one on the way. And obviously her story Innocence Lost is really big. It's up for a National Magazine Award. And I recently did a lot of help with her on this church fire story that's in this month's issue. So really interesting. It's about these two sort of young guys that got caught up in burning down 10 churches. And yeah, it was very interesting to work with that.
Lane knows all the juicy details that didn't make it into the story for various legal and other reasons.
But yes, this is Pam Colloff.
Thank you.
So you're welcome to start out. We've all read Innocence Lost, and I think that's what we want to talk about first. But you can say a few things, or we can just have at you.
Sure. Let me just give you like a 2-minute backtrack into how I got into this that just riffs off a little bit of what we were talking about, and then I'll go into the story. But I had sort of two things in my life that made me know that I wanted to do this, and I just wanted to share that in case it's helpful. When I was in high school, we had a terrible high school newspaper that basically just printed press releases from the administration. And I had no idea that I wanted to do journalism. I just knew that I was very irritated with the newspaper and its lack of integrity. And the poet Allen Ginsberg came to speak at my high school, and I was a big fan of his work, and our newspaper decided that he was not worthy of covering, which I was kind of amazed by. And so after he did this amazing reading, two friends of mine and I decided, we had sort of vaguely talked about trying to start an alternative newspaper, but it had not progressed beyond just a conversation. But we went up to him and we presented ourselves as the editors of the alternative newspaper at our high school, which of course didn't exist. And would he have a little bit of time to give us an interview? He spent the next 3 hours with us talking to us about his life and his poetry and his adventures, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with his life or his poetry, but he was a fascinating person. And I was so blown away by that. I thought, okay, so I'm not a journalist, but if I tell people I'm a journalist, not only will they talk to me and for some reason take me seriously, even though I'm 17, but I can ask them anything that I want to ask them. Like if I just came up to him after the reading and I said, I love your poetry, but I was wondering if, why would he answer those questions? So I loved that because I've always been a nosy person. And that was sort of the beginning for me. And then in college, and I'll go quickly through this, but there was an alternative newspaper at Brown that did more interesting work than the regular newspaper. And there was a story that I wrote, it's a long story how I sort of happened into this piece, but there was a fraternity on campus, and some of the fraternity brothers were doing some interesting stuff which involved getting girls very, very drunk and then videotaping them doing various sexual things and then distributing the videotapes. And to make a very long story short, I got two guys who had left the fraternity over this to talk to me about it, so I had corroborating evidence of this. And we ran a big story about it, and it was a very big deal. It got picked up by the AP, caused a lot of problems on campus. And it was a fascinating experience for me because it actually created change on campus. And it was a very scary experience too, because this particular fraternity was very well funded by alumni who were not happy about the story. And I was surprised when the administration did not back me up on my story and actually asked me to hand over my notes and had meetings with deans and various things. It all ended up fine. I graduated. They changed their policy on the fraternity, and a lot of different things happened. But that was sort of the Ginsberg lesson was, this is fun, and the fraternity story, I think, taught me that, well, okay, this is more than just being fun. If you write a story and you say something important and you can back it up with facts, that maybe you can actually get something to change, which is what happened with this story, luckily enough, that we're going to talk about. And there were a lot of other experiences in there, internships at the Village Voice and Spin and other things where I just thought, this is the coolest thing, and if I can somehow make a living doing this, that would be really great. And I'm kind of, we were just talking, I'm still amazed that somebody pays me to do what I do. But that's how I got into this, and then was at Texas Monthly for a long time, and I've written about a lot of different things, including George Bush's ranch. But criminal justice has always been the thing I've been primarily interested in, just because I think in Texas it's obviously such a rich and important thing to be writing about, and in particular the death penalty. And I had started looking into the Cameron Todd Willingham case a few years ago. I had done preliminary reporting. I was about halfway through reading the trial transcript. I had contacted all the players and told them that I was working on this. And I was far enough through the transcript that I knew this was a really important case to be writing about, and I was very, very excited about it. At which point my editor, who shall remain nameless, pulled me off of the story to work on our style issue, in which I wrote a feature story about quinceañeras, which was fine. And when I came back to the Cameron Todd Willingham story, the first call I made was to his mother, and I said, you know, it takes a while to report and write a story, so I'd been gone for about 2 months. I said, I'm so sorry, okay, I'm finally back. What's your schedule next week so I can come up and see you? And she started telling me her schedule, and she said, you know, it's funny, I can't do her accent, but it's funny that you called. There was just a reporter here from New York City. He was here for a week. I don't know if you know him. I've got his card here. His name is David Gran, and I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with David Gran's work, but that's the worst thing you could hear as a reporter. It's the best thing that ever happened to that case, so it's all good. But I remember at the time just being completely devastated. There are other reporters where I would have tried to write the story still, but hearing the words David Gran, I went into my editor's office and said, sorry, gotta find another story. But I was very inspired by the piece that he wrote for The New Yorker on that case, and if y'all haven't read it, you absolutely must read it. It's just a brilliant, brilliant piece of reporting. It's a very complicated case, and he tells the story in such a way that I don't think you can get to the end of the story and not have at least very, very serious doubts that this man was guilty, who was already executed. So all of that's a long way of saying, I'd also had my eye on the Anthony Graves case because in 2006 his conviction was overturned by the Fifth Circuit, and it's not every day that the Fifth Circuit overturns a conviction in a death penalty case. And I'd been sort of just keeping an eye on it, not doing anything more than that, because I knew he was going to be up for retrial. And I figured, well, the opportunity to do that story is when he's retried, and it's going to be this amazing trial featuring the best female prosecutor in Texas and the best female defense attorney, and it'll be this interesting courtroom drama and blah, blah, blah. So time goes by, and by last year, he'd been sitting in the county jail for 4 years awaiting retrial, which is, I'd never heard of that before. I don't know if you've heard of someone being in county for 4 years waiting for their trial. I thought that was really odd. So I went and talked to my editor, and I said, I don't know what's going on with this case, but the fact that his conviction was overturned and they still don't have they had a trial date, but I think it was a year ahead of time. it's going to be 5 years later that he's retried. I think obviously we need to look into this case. And so I just did sort of the basic, again, preliminary stuff, reading. There were 2 trial transcripts to read in this one because there's Robert Carter's trial and Anthony Graves' trial. Reading the trial transcripts, reading the case file, and all that took quite a bit of time, but you couldn't read those documents, which filled, I wish I had a picture. There were over 10,000 pages of documents in this case, so it filled my entire office. I don't think you ever saw that, but you couldn't get into my office at one point. But you couldn't read those documents and not be really, really troubled by the case. And so I just kept reading, kept trying to find different documents to clarify different things. Interviewed a lot of people. The entire process took, from beginning to end, took 5 months, which is not normal at all. This was assigned as a 6,000 to 7,000 word story, and it ran at 14,000, which also is not normal. And I started driving everyone in my office crazy because I would periodically run into my editor's office and say, okay, I think it's an 8,000 word story. Or actually, I think it's a 10,000 word story. And then there's no way I can tell this in less than 12,000 words. And it actually, I know this sounds crazy, it was very challenging to tell this story in 14,000 words. It could easily have been longer than that. But it was such a complicated case that just to lay out the basic facts of it took a lot of space and a lot of time just to make sure that I understood the case. The prosecutor, Charles Sebesta, and this made more sense to me later on, but when I initially interviewed him, told me things that were not factually correct, but I didn't know that. And so there's just a lot of sorting through what was fact and what was fiction.
What did he tell you? I mean, what are the things that stick out to you that were wrong?
So many things. He then made up things about me, but that's another story that I'll tell you later. He told me that Anthony and Cookie, who's someone mentioned the story, who were first cousins, were having an affair, which was not true. He told me that various witnesses had, these unimpeachable accounts of overhearing Anthony confess his guilt, which wasn't true. To be honest, very little of what he told me was not colored by either shading the truth or things that just were not true. I remember when it was a week before we went to press and we were going through fact-checking with him, which was a nightmare. And my fact-checker was getting confused because he would call, typically what we do is, basically I annotate this entire story from beginning to end, and I say, here's where I got this bit of information, here's where I got this bit of information. And then the fact-checker calls each person or looks at each document and makes sure that that's correct. So he would call the prosecutor and he would ask him sometimes very basic facts, and the prosecutor would say that's not true. So, key example, and then we'll get into questions. But one of the biggest problems with this case was the night before Robert Carter testified against Anthony Graves, he told Charles Sebesta, I did this all by myself. Anthony didn't have anything to do with this. Sebesta would later claim that this was disclosed the next morning to Anthony's attorney in a hallway at the courthouse. The attorney said that actually that never happened, which means that he was withholding exculpatory evidence. That's very important. So we had 17 pages of testimony before a federal court from Anthony's defense attorney saying over and over again, under oath, this man did not tell me this. If he had told me this, this would have been pivotal in this trial. I would have questioned this witness completely differently. I mean, he was adamant. And Sebesta kept telling my fact checker, well, the lawyers never denied my story. He he's, he said he doesn't remember this, and we actually faxed him the 17 pages of testimony before the federal court, and he still wouldn't budge. So we then realized we had a completely unreliable narrator, and that we had to just rely on documents and not on him, because we couldn't trust anything that he said, which a week before publication was not a comfortable position to be in. But anyway, there are a million different aspects of this story to talk about, and I'd love to get into that, but I'll just say that 6 weeks after the story came out, charges were dropped, and Anthony was released, and there's a follow-up story, if you guys are ever interested in reading it, called Innocence Found, that's on our website about that and sort of how that came about. But it was a very exciting fall. So, and Anthony now lives in Austin, and so we have lunch about once a month, and it's pretty great. So anyway, there are a million.
How's he doing?
He's doing very well. He is a very strong person mentally, and he has much more grace than I would in such a situation. He told me that mentally, to survive, he had to make a decision when he was on death row to let go of his anger, because he wasn't going to make it, and he was going to go crazy. And he really did that. I don't know how he did that, but he's very zen in his life. And I don't mean that he doesn't have moments of extreme anger, but generally speaking, he's doing very well. He's got a job and a house, and sort of in awe of him. But anyway, that was a very long little spiel. But if there are things that you guys want to ask me about that would be helpful as far as how this narrative goes, or things that relate to your own work, this piece feel free.
Well, I remember going through and transcribing the interviews for the story, and you had a ridiculous amount of transcribing.
Yes, I'm really sorry about that.
Which I love. But how did you decide that you were done? Like, you said, I can't do any more reporting. I can actually write the story now.
I never feel that way. It's usually the looming terror of the deadline, and I usually push it as far as I possibly can. I love reporting, and I hate writing. And so if left to my own devices, I would report any story for years and years and years and just talk about it to my friends and never write anything. So, and my editors know that, and so they have these sort of terror tactics they do with me. But with this one, I literally ran out of time. It was originally slated for our September issue, ran in October, and they had secretly decided that there was no way I was ever going to make the September deadline, but they didn't tell me that, and so I just had to stop reporting at a certain point and start writing. And then they sprang that news on me at the end. I was very happy. But it's really hard. I think if this is helpful at all, to me, the point where I know I'm ready to start writing, though I'm not saying that I always actually do that, is when I start knowing the answers to questions, when I start hearing the same things in interviews. Like I'm doing a story right now where I'm going to be going on my second reporting trip this week, and it's just, I don't know anything. Like, I know the parameters of this case I'm writing about, but everything's going to be new. And I know there's going to be a point, probably in about 6 weeks, where I start running across the same stuff again. And I'll know it's time. So. Do you guys have any, and if you want to do like process questions, if that helps at all with your own work, that's great too. This is a very unusual story because of its length, so.
Larry Wright's class, you talked about his method for like organizing.
Oh, well,
his
Larry's
lines,
crazy.
right?
His files. Did he show you his files? Yeah.
So I wondered how you kind of organize all of this evidence and everything for yourself before you write.
I'm in awe of Larry. I've been to Larry's house, and I've seen, there's a room. I don't know if he brought in
he didn't bring all that in, but we'd watched My Trip to Al-Qaeda, and there's a scene in there filmed in the room.
Yeah, it's
And he proudly goes through his Neanderthal filing system for us. And he did bring in one pad to show us all the stuff. It was like a stage prop.
yeah, it's. I actually would love to talk to him about researching the Scientology piece. I don't know if he talked about that at all, but I'm in awe of Larry and what he does, but I go about things in a different way, and it's because I love researching so much. I have one Word document where I enter everything. I have a random thought on the way to work about, oh, this might be a good segue into the next section, or I wonder whatever happened to that bit character. I sort of put my questions at the top, and they get resolved as I'm doing my reporting. And then I input my notes. I input, if people have written about the case before, citations from newspapers or whatever. And it starts to take on an organization as it goes. Like, there will be subheadings that create themselves. Like, in Anthony's case, there was a cookie section, and there was a Robert Carter section, and there was a Charles Sebesta section. And then those gradually, and it took me a long time to be able to figure this out, those sort of groupings by subject, I then make an outline from that. And I sort of look for dramatic moments that might be a good beginning or ending point for a section. Like in the Graves story, when they find out that his conviction's been overturned, but they can't tell him that, they can't reach him. I thought that was such an amazing moment. And that he's told by another inmate. So then I start forming it into a very, very rough outline, and then I write from that. I find what's great about having one Word document is I can do a word search. Like, okay, there was something about the knife I'm wondering. Okay, I'll do a word search for knife, and everything is in one place. But I've also found that, and I would love to ask Larry this, but you can spend so long organizing your material that you're taking away from your writing time, and you really, really need your writing time. And so I'm trying, it's really hard, but I'm trying to get less fetishistic about arranging my notes perfectly and color coding things, and just start writing. And if I have a question or a loose end, deal with that when I get to it. I don't know if that's good advice for the length of things that you guys are doing, but what Larry does, I think when you're writing a book or you're writing about things as complex as what he does, I think you have to have a system like he does. And he also has New Yorker fact checking, which I had to go through once, and I hope to never go through again, which is brutal. And so you have to have everything. The Graves story, when we were done with fact checking, had 900 footnotes, so that was pretty bad. But
how did you convince those frat boys to talk to you?
That's a good question. I had found out about all this not in the capacity of a reporter. I had, and I think when you're in school, this is often how you get some of your best stories, but friend of mine's roommate who was on the swim team. It was a social group that I normally wouldn't have had access to be honest with you. I was in like the arty literary crowd, and these guys were football players. But my friend's roommate was on the swim team from her freshman year, and she knew these guys, and they had left the fraternity because they were so disgusted by this whole thing, and had talked to the roommate about it, who had then talked to my friend about it, who had then told me about it, just as like, this crazy thing is going on at DTAL, and so that began, it's so long ago, but I think initially the go-between was her roommate. I knew her roommate, not super well, but well enough, and talked to her about, would they ever, if I could keep them anonymous, would they ever want to talk to me for a story, and here's why I need both of them. I can't just have one person saying this. And through them, that eventually came about. And I think that's a trick with every story. I don't think it was unique to that story, but how do you get people to talk who often shouldn't talk to you, or you know, and I'm on a story right now where I need this former prosecutor to talk to me, and she's not going to talk to me. And I will do what I did the last time I was pregnant, which is I will show up at her door when it is the summer, and I will introduce myself, and I will look very, very pregnant and very uncomfortable. And as happened the last time I did this, she will probably invite me in to talk to her. There are different things that you have to do.
So look
I'm not saying that you do anything that's
I'm not sure I
unethical.
have advice for the rest of you either.
All I'm saying is you don't know whether it's going to be a friend who can lead you to somebody, or maybe there's something you have in common, or whatever it is. And a lot of times if people won't talk to you on the phone or won't answer an email, it's much harder to say no to someone in person. And you know, when you see someone in person, even if they're scared to talk to you, you usually don't look scary in person. And even if they won't talk to you, you can get amazing stuff. There was a story I wrote probably about 8 years ago about a priest who I believe had murdered this woman, and this was many, many years ago. And this was in 1960 in South Texas, and at that time, if you committed a horrible crime and you were a priest, you were moved, you weren't prosecuted. And I wrote a story about what it appeared had happened here and how this man had done this. And this guy, who was a retired priest by the time I was writing the story, you know, wasn't going to talk to me. He was living in Phoenix, and I went out there and I knocked on his door, and he came to the door, and there was my closing scene. He didn't give me an interview, but he gave me, and I wish I could remember the exact phrase, it was the last sentence of the story. But he didn't behave at all. If someone came to your door and said, I'm writing a story about this woman, and I believe that you murdered her in 1960, and I would really, really, really like a response from you. As you know, I've been trying to contact you for months. You would probably say, I can't talk to you. I'm appalled by what you're saying. I would never hurt someone. Go away. Something to that effect. And instead, this guy gave me this really weird smile, and he said, you know, it's a very interesting mystery, isn't it? Or something. I can't, I had my tape recorder going, so I was able to get that fact checked. But it was stranger than that. I can't remember what the exact sentence was. But so he didn't give me an interview, but I had a great scene, and I had a great ending to the story that told you everything you needed to know. I couldn't say, this man's a murderer. I let him say it. So I never underestimate, and it's so uncomfortable, but never underestimate going to someone's, I don't mean being a stalker or crazy, but trying to get the interview. And even if you don't get the interview, that tells you a lot. In this story, Cookie wouldn't talk to me, and I didn't end up ultimately using this, but I knew that she worked at the Walmart, and I hate doing stuff like this. I often do this stuff to make my editor happy, so I can tell him, like, I really tried, you know. And so I went to the Walmart, and I was like, oh, I'll never see this woman. And she was the first person I saw when I walked in, and she had the name tag that said Teresa, which is her formal name. And so I introduced myself, and she wouldn't talk to me, but just the expression on her face, like, there's so much more about her in this case than I'll ever know, and her expression told me that. And it wasn't anything I could really put in the story, but it just helped me understand the case a little bit better. So, am I giving this terrible advice?
You're doing good.
Stalk your sources, pretend you're pregnant. No.
With Sebasta, did you know that first time out that he was, I mean, obviously you didn't know everything, but did you realize early on that he was incredibly unreliable?
No. I didn't. And he, there was a 48 Hours episode devoted to the case last Saturday that he was on, and you can watch him on that if you want. But it's very, very tabloidy, but just, but anyway, but he comes across, and again, this is another great lesson of just life, not just reporting. He comes across as the most reasonable person, and he's this silver-haired man. He's 70. He's was district attorney for 25 years. He's the voice of authority, and he's not someone who you immediately distrust. And I think that that's one of the hardest things in a story, is to figure out, a story like this, is who to trust and who not to trust. And I think it takes some time to figure that out, and sometimes you make judgment calls that aren't right. But no, I knew that there were questions about his ethical behavior in the trial, but I didn't realize that he literally would look me in the eye and tell me things that had never happened. And that was very disturbing to sort of deal with that. I don't know if you transcribed any of his interviews. Yeah.
And he said everything very
Yeah, very,
even.
yeah. He was a good prosecutor.
Yeah, did you ever, did you start out wanting change, or did you just through your reporting realize this is really bigger than what I expected it to be?
The latter. I mean, I knew there were questions about his case, and I was interested in finding out how legitimate those, issues were. I knew that he had always maintained his innocence, but many people maintain their innocence who aren't innocent. But yeah, there was a point, I started reading everything at some point in April, and I held off on contacting him because I wanted to figure out what I thought based on, objective materials first. And talking to him was very powerful too, because usually if someone's facing any sort of trial, like shoplifting charges, their attorney will tell them not to talk to a reporter. They're facing capital murder charges and the death penalty. It's unheard of that you, A, get an interview, B, the lawyers aren't present, and C, you're told by the lawyers, ask anything you want, whatever you want, nothing's off limits. And then that when you're asking questions, the person answers everything and says things, honestly, that aren't always flattering. Yes, I sold drugs at one point in my life. Yes, I had kids and I didn't stick around. And what was so striking about talking to him after having done the reading was there were things that he remembered and said that perfectly dovetailed with things that were in the case file that were just sort of extraordinary. And so after talking to him, after reading everything, I did want change. I wanted to write, the story was so complicated that I wanted to write this case in such a way that anyone could A, understand it, and B, be moved enough by it to be appalled by what had happened. And that was hard to figure out how to do. And I got 2 visits with him, and I remember the second one, by the second one I was positive that he had not done this, and by that point I knew his family and had met his kids and all this stuff. And I remember leaving the jail that day and walking back to my car, and I was just emotionally devastated. Like, I know this man didn't do this, and I get to go home to my family, and he doesn't. And, how do I write a story that can cause change but isn't preachy or doesn't go too far? And I initially started writing the story in such a way that his voice was in it a lot, because he's just an incredible narrator of these events that happened to him. But it took his side too soon. It was like, well, why should I trust this guy? Of course he said he wasn't there. Of course he's, that's what I would say. And so I cut his voice out of the story, which was painful, because there was so much good stuff there. But I think it worked more effectively rhetorically to do that. I know he was a little disappointed by that because we had spent so much time corresponding. But yeah, I did want it to do something. And how do you write a piece that makes people outraged but doesn't show your outrage to such a degree that you become unreliable as the narrator of the story? That's hard.
You didn't choose to use first person.
Mm-hmm.
Did you think about it?
I did a little bit at the end. I actually at the end of that story, and I think throughout the second story.
Yes.
I did, and again, I worried that it would tip the scales too much. That it would be too, that A, it would be distracting, and B, that it would show my hand. I had a very strong opinion while writing it. I don't know if that's good or bad to say, but having read everything, I had a very strong opinion, and I worried that showing that too much, rather than just telling, would be counterproductive. So.
And how would you describe the structure that you did use?
This story is the most basic structure you can use. I really struggled with that. I thought about beginning with him in jail and doing all these different things. The narrative itself is so complicated that I thought, just tell it chronologically. Just tell it from beginning to end, and do as little editorializing as possible. Just, he's at his home, he's arrested, he's this and this. One thing that I did very deliberately do in the end of the first section was I described when he's in the police station and they're reading him these charges, and at that point I think as a reader you don't know what to believe. You think, well, this is kind of a messed up case, but the guy said he was there, and maybe he was there. But I wanted, since I had cut his voice out of the rest of the story, I was hoping that readers could somehow connect with him in that situation of imagining, like, okay, I'm at my mom's house, and a cop comes to the door and takes me to the police station, and I am told I am accused of capital murder. I think different people I've talked to had different points in the story where they started to, connect with him. But I was trying to lay the groundwork there in the beginning. So.
I'm kind of curious about the sort of connection you described with Anthony.
Mhm.
Like with this other story, with Jason, you were talking about how
It's
no matter how much
one of the arsonists.
Yeah, no matter how much you corresponded with him and spoke with him,
Mm-hmm.
you still didn't feel like you understood what his story was, or like
Mhm.
why he did what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that's sort of key in a story like this, is to just feel that connection with your main subject?
I think I don't think you have to feel that at all, but I think when it's a story about whether someone committed a horrible crime or not, I think it's key to feel like they are being as open with you as possible. And with the church fire story, which is in our current issue, Jason is just such a complicated person, and I wanted to try to explain him to readers. And he was a hard nut to crack. And when I finally found out some things that he didn't want me to publish that didn't end up in the story, and confronted him with those things, he really freaked out. So there's a lot. Every story, there's a lot that's left on the cutting room floor, and often it's the most interesting stuff. So.
Did you go back and have a sort of conclusion interview with Sebasta where you
Mm-hmm.
confronted him with what you knew?
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that.
I did. I started reading everything in April. I think I interviewed him either in late May or early June. I was still reading when I talked to him. And then in August, when I was writing, I sort of went over some additional things with him. It then turned into he started calling and emailing every day. He became very frantic as the story neared publication, and erratic. And so we would have these strange phone calls. He would call me and he would sort of berate me about something for about 10 minutes, and then he would calm down, and then he could talk about things. It was a very strange.
So he knew you were discovering things that weren't,
Mhm.
because you were asking him more questions along the way, and
I think, and this isn't anyone's fault, but for someone who's doing, say, daily newspaper coverage of it, if he said, just as an example, well, this attorney never said that, and that never happened, okay, well, what are they gonna do? They didn't have the time to read through all this stuff, and so when I was basically doing early fact-checking with him against trial transcripts and other things, he got very, very uncomfortable. And yeah, it did not end well. It was very strange
talk about
experience.
that. What do you mean?
Our last conversation, he had sort of hinted at legal action for the last couple weeks before the story came out. And he then made a very overt threat about that and sent me a document that he said he was going to send to all these different media outlets that was going to state all the untruths that I was reporting and all these different things. And he was trying to intimidate me. I later found out that he went to the local law enforcement authorities and tried to make up some things that I had done so that they could search my office. I mean, he's a very strange person. But I think he thought if he did all that we wouldn't run the story. And then we did run the story, and he started his own website and responded in different ways.
Did you have at the end of the trail, a sort of sit-down final with
He
him?
he
Or
wouldn't do that.
At that point, that wouldn't happen.
Basically, our relationship was severed, and he would call me, and I never knew when he was going to call me, and he would say things, and I would just have my tape recorder running, and that was really all I could get from him.
Mhm.
So, yeah, there's so many things in this story that are extremes. I've had people get very upset before, or people threaten to sue before. I've never had things devolve to that point, and at that point we had to get lawyers involved and other things I'm probably not supposed to talk about.
So you become sort of, nobody else is both talking to Sebasta and talking to Anthony, right?
Right.
Just
Right.
you.
Right.
How'd that feel?
That was strange because I was taking information sort of, I mean, they didn't know this, but okay, he would tell me this and then I would run it past this person and vice versa. But the consistency of what Anthony said again and again matched up to things that had happened, and they didn't with the prosecutor. And so Anthony became the reliable narrator, if that makes sense.
How much influence do you think your story had or didn't have over what happened in the end? I mean, you guys, most of these guys didn't read Innocence Found, the second one, which is shorter, incidentally, and which I read the other day.
It is shorter.
Sigler, eventually another prosecutor's given the case, a very famous prosecutor with a long history of success in death penalty cases, and she looks like she's going to be, pretty tough. And the Texas Rangers, of course, had backed this original case, but they begin to get going on it. They had been going on it for a while when your story came out. What, if any, impact do you think your story had?
I think we won't ever 100% know that, but they started prepping for trial in the spring and then put things on hold till August. And so when I was writing my story, they were going back and looking through the files and reinvestigating things. And I think they obviously had a lot of questions as well. It was the first time anyone had really vigorously, from a prosecution and law enforcement standpoint, vigorously investigated the case. I think what helped were two things. There were things that were in the story that they didn't know that got the prosecution to sit down with the defense team at this very uncomfortable and bizarre meeting that they had, where they spent an afternoon. It's not normal that a prosecutor in a death penalty case says, "Hey, defense lawyers, do you want to just chat for a couple hours about the case?" And I have some qualms about it. Just wanted to ask you guys a couple questions. And they were very suspicious. They thought, well, this is a trial tactic, and she's trying to get information from us. And that meeting, a lot came out of that meeting, because Nicole Caceres was in that meeting, and she knew everything about the case, and Kelly Siegler could ask her a lot of questions. I think the other thing it did is it created, it helped, unintentionally, I never, when I wrote this story, I thought he was gonna go to trial and get a death sentence again. I had no idea that they had any doubts about this case. And many people have said to me who've been up against Siegler in court, she could have gotten a conviction against him. It was a very emotional case. And she as much said that to me. I showed the pictures of the kids, and we're done. I think what the attention that the story generated, which again, this was all, I had no idea any of this was going to happen, was it sort of provided an exit strategy. She's someone who loves publicity. And I think that after talking to her, I don't think she would have taken this case to trial. Would she have quietly exited the case? Maybe it would have been punted to someone else. I don't know. But this provided sort of a new storyline or a way of getting out of the case in a very dramatic fashion that got a tremendous amount of media attention. She had run for district attorney of Harris County and lost, and one of the main reasons that she lost was she was seen as too much of a member of the Good Old Boy Network. And by helping to exonerate Anthony, I think that helped her too. I think it helped show that she was a fair-minded person, show that she wasn't necessarily part of the system, and so on. So there were competing things, and I think that's always, I don't think people just do things because it's the right thing to do or it's the good thing to do. You have to also hope there's something in it for them too. Sorry, that sounds cynical, but so to what degree those things came into play, I don't know.
What really struck me in reading the second story was the passion of Siegler and Kaufman, a couple of the investigators, saying this is the worst thing we've ever seen, and they had nothing, no evidence at all. Now, you've just, I think, explained a little bit of that in Siegler's case, like when she's going to do something, she's going to do it all the way, because that's what you do when you're on stage.
Charles Sebesta was on trial in what she did, exiting the case.
She really, really changed, it wasn't just, well, we don't have enough to prove it.
Right.
It was all out, this is the worst thing I've ever seen.
Right.
What was that about? You think positioning herself, or just the way she does things on stage, or was that your story, or what was that about?
No, I think it was a lot of different things. I think that she is someone, she's a very black and white person, and she's a very extreme person. People are good or they're evil. And at some point, after reading everything she read, she had the same sense of outrage about this prosecutor that she usually does about a defendant. And she was, it was so much more powerful to hear her, to watch her say this than to read her quotes. But
The quotes are pretty good.
yeah, she's fascinating. But I think what was so sort of painful about all that was the Attorney General's office had been involved in the case for the last 4 years and just sat on it. There was an investigator there, we later learned, who thought that Anthony was innocent, and nobody really cared. And it really wasn't until Siegler and Otto Hannock, this new Texas Ranger, looked into things that it became apparent that Anthony's case really hadn't been investigated. I mean, all those years, there's just, the Rangers never talked to his alibi witnesses. There was like police 101 work that was never done. And while the AG's office had the case, they were trying to cook up different evidence against him. They used a dog handler, this guy who's now been completely discredited and put hundreds of cases in jeopardy, who basically, this was the guy, you didn't quite have enough to take someone to trial. Well, you called Keith Pikett, the dog handler, and his dog would find your defendant's scent on something, and then you would get a conviction. And the Attorney General's office actually used this guy to try to build a case against Anthony, and we did a whole other article on Keith Pikett. It's junk science. But anyway, that's a side note. But
I guess it's sort of interesting is because people can be convinced by that, because I remember learning in like psychology classes and various like demonstrations on Oprah and stuff how unreliable eyewitness testimony can be, but juries are very convinced by that.
yeah, and there's a bill before the legislature right now. I can't remember what. I think that addresses that. Yeah.
It's just sort of interesting.
I got a Willingham question. We've sort of been working on the premise, or I've been working on the premise, maybe we both have, that what's so interesting about Willingham right now is that it just goes on, and that in fact after his execution, the sort of ticking clock stopped ticking, and so for the family and the Willingham proponents, there's no deadline anymore.
Right.
They can go as long as it takes, and the state is determined to stop them.
Right.
And so here we are, so many years, 7 after he was executed, almost 20 since the original deed, and yet there's no end in sight.
Right.
What strikes you, I mean, if you were able to pick it up, never mind David Gran, what would you write now, you think?
About the Willingham
Yeah.
story? John Bradley, who you hit upon, I thought that was a really smart way into the story. He is a fascinating character.
He's the Forensic Commission chairman who's about to lose his job. But he's the governor's guy.
I mean, I think that's a great way in. I think just showing all these years later how, an execution doesn't erase the crime, doesn't erase the pain on either side of the crime, and how it goes on and on and on. What fascinates me about crime stories, and his is a prime example, is there's one act, either deliberate or the space heater got knocked over, whatever happened, and the ripple effects of that, and the dozens and dozens, sometimes hundreds of people who are affected by just one instant or one bad choice, and the years and years and years that those effects are felt. It's just so amazing, and it's so interesting narratively. But I think John Bradley is fascinating, and I know she won't talk, but Willingham's wife, she's fascinating too.
Well, like you were saying about executions, one execution vigil that I attended for Timothy Adams was particularly interesting when the issue is somebody who kills their own family member.
Right.
Because then, the same family member that had to deal with that death, that's the victim family member, is
Right.
also related to the person who's getting executed.
Yeah,
So
and he
complicates things.
had a lot of supporters.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it wasn't an innocence claim. But
No, but it was, there was just, concern that, he should get clemency because of his
Well,
previous
from one
life.
side of the family was,
Yeah.
his family was
Well,
supportive.
yeah, but
I couldn't quite read where the other side of the family was.
I know.
I mean, what's your reading of that? Jess was,
the
Hers?
Timothy.
yeah,
So-
with Adam.
I don't know. It could have gone either way because, like, in some interviews, they were very they were actually kind of compassionate in the Netherlands.
Mhm.
So.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's a complicated place to be.
Yeah.
Any more questions for Pam?
I have a question. This always comes up in class whenever we look at criminal justice stories. So I'll just ask you, what do you think of the term advocacy journalism? Is it like,
That's a great question, because when I hear that term, I'm grossed out. Yet you could argue that a story like that is advocacy journalism. I guess rightly or wrongly, I think of advocacy journalism as really like wearing its advocacy on its sleeve in a way that, and I read these publications and I like them a lot, but when I think of Mother Jones or The Nation or sometimes the Texas Observer, or I'm using only examples from the left, but they're examples from the right too. Just as a reader, I don't get as emotionally involved in those stories because I feel like the hand has been shown. So I don't know if I'm saying that advocacy journalism is great if you just hide your intentions. I'm not really sure. I haven't thought this through. And I think it is good to try to affect change in a situation of injustice if you can with your writing. But I think the key is stick to the facts, and if there's a sentence that is opinion rather than just stating something that happened or that you can point to in a document, I think sometimes you can lose credibility. Sometimes it's done very effectively, but the car seat story that we're
That we're
talking
probably
about is-
not going to read.
yeah.
Gene Weingarten's baby.
Would you call
baby
that
story.
advocacy journalism?
You know, I've gone around and around in this. We talked about this before. Is it just a matter of hiding one's intentions as a writer? Gene clearly makes clear, Weingarten in that story, that he's out to
Right.
discover why people inadvertently lock their babies in the car. Are they guilty of something, or is it just a horrible mistake? And he has a very strong opinion at the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
But he seems to earn it
Mhm.
through his reporting, just like, you know, John Ronson earns his conclusion about the credit card debt and the suicide of a
Mhm.
credit card holder, just like Kate Boo earns it
Mhm.
in The Marriage Cure. I think any means that works for you is the right means, but if you don't believe in something, you probably wouldn't have pursued the story in the first place.
Right. But earning it is a great way of talking about it.
Yeah, there's some pretty thin lines. The nice thing about this course, since it's advanced feature writing, is that we can make things more complicated rather than making them simpler. Because life does tend to be morally complicated. So that's one good definition of advanced feature writing, when we take on complicated stuff.
Well, and just one little thing in there is that, this is connected but not connected, is that those details that make people or things jump off the page, I think is what will get your reader feeling passionately about something and makes it not feel like homework and makes it something where you're really involved. And I mentioned this before, I loved in your piece, you mentioned about your, the Huntsville Item reporter. Before you ever mention that she has children, you talk about how there are crayons rolling on the floor of her car. And there's just a great sort of novelistic detail. And I think when you can find those little moments or little details of color, it just helps make the narrative more interesting and pulls people along, which is not connected to what we're talking about. I'm sorry.
All right, well, we're going to let Pam go